Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'd like to present you and welcome you to another lecture in our series, The Battle of Hampton Roads, which took place at the Chamberlain Hotel in August of 1997. Our speaker, Dr. Gene Smith, was like a meteor that passed fairly quickly through our orbit. I had him on a couple of programs, and he just kind of disappeared and then fell out of the Civil War community and stuff. Shane, really decent guy, fine speaker. I think you'll clearly find that there. He was an expert on the Battle of Mobile Bay. He was, as I recollect, he was either a professor of history at either Rice or Texas Christian University. I'm not sure which it was. I think he was in Houston, so it could have been Rice, but again, not remembering at this stage of my recollections. But Gene had written a number of shorter volumes that had been published. I'm trying to think of the name of the series that published them, but he didn't do full-length studies of anything. But what he had presented, he may even have written a book on this subject on Catesby Ape Jones. And the reason I asked him to speak about Jones is Jones is one of the big figures in the fighting for the Monitor and the Merrimack. He was a resident of Jamestown Island at the start of the war, and had really kind of slacked off. The Jones family name had been involved with the United States Navy since before the war, and at the very start, when Southerners are rallying on the peninsula in and around Williamsburg, Jones presents himself as willing to help. I think trying to develop the fortifications at Mulberry Island, which is where Fort Eustis is today, and when the Navy Yard starts spinning up and under the command of Sidney Smith Lee, Jones finds himself drawn back into naval operations. And as I'm recollecting, I think he was the exec officer on the Virginia at the famous battle. And when Buchanan is temporarily blinded by a powder shot that while he's looking through his periscope, Jones assumes the command of the Merrimack for the balance of the battle. And so Jones is a very significant guy to bring up and to talk about in this particular themed conference. And I'm not remembering because I only ever encountered Gene twice, and we just never kept up. And so I'm not remembering exactly why I had asked him to do this, but I know that I never selected anybody who didn't have bona fides that showed that they very clearly could handle the subject at hand, because that was a standard that we have always set. And so I suspect there was something in his background that caught my attention, that caused me to want to bring him on. Perhaps Joe Glathar might even have told me about him. That's a very real possibility, because Glathar was at the University of Houston at the time, and so he may very well have introduced me to Gene. As a matter of fact, the more I think of it, I think that's exactly how it happened. Was that he knew Gene, and when I was looking for naval people, he put the two of us together, and so Gene came out to speak to us. Another thing that I remember about this, which really impressed the hell out of me, this was at the time that Ed was doing 200 plus days a year of touring and stuff. And I remember for this particular program, because he had another program to go to and stuff, and his schedule was so tight, I remember him accepting me, getting him and booking him on a flight out of Washington National at 5 a.m., which meant that he had to get up and leave his house at 3:45 in the morning. And the man was 74 years old at the time, and yet didn't bellyache a bit, took whatever cost us the least amount of money and so forth to support us and so forth, and never took a penny in compensation. All we had to do for him was just pay his transportation and pay for his hotel and provide his meals, and he provided everything else. And so this too I remember, because I remember having to go down to the Norfolk airport at 6:45 in the morning and meet Ed's flight coming in from DC. Oh no, it was 5:45, because flight left at 5. So he was in at 5:45 in the morning to meet him and then carry him over to the Chamberlain, get him in his hotel and get him ready for the touring and stuff that he was going to do, which included the porpoises and everything else. So I hope you enjoyed the recollection. I realize it's a little long-winded for what Gene is going to talk about, but the topic is important. Catesby 8-Bar Jones is probably a name. I think he ends up in Selma at the end of the war. I mean, he's very important, and he's probably one of the most important people most of you have never heard of. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. I think you'll learn something about this man, Catesby 8-Bar Jones.
There now with both Steve and Gene Smith, they've got making a real powerhouse Civil War faculty down there. Although I don't know that folks at Texas Christian necessarily view it that way, but it's certainly our good fortune that they are down there, because of course Jack Law is down there as well. Gene Smith is a relative newcomer in the Civil War community. He is not widely known yet within this community. However, he has in fact put out a very concise and solid book on the Monitor and the Merrimack, which you see in the back of the room there. This is the first time that I have met Gene, but I understand that he is a marvelous speaker. He has brought a high-tech presentation to us, and I must admit to you that his high-tech and my low-tech capability to respond to it, combined with the natural technology of Palladium Windows, will diminish some of the impact of the audio visuals that he has. However, I hope that that will not diminish it too much, and I'm certainly sure it will not affect the high quality of his presentation. Please join me in welcoming Gene Smith.
Thank you. I am, as Lynn mentioned, I am a relative newcomer to the Civil War field. My area of primary interest, and I guess my area of specialty, is more naval history. And the way I've come at this particular presentation is to come via Catesby Roger Jones. In fact, I've been writing for the last 5-6 years a biography of his uncle, Thomas App Catesby Jones. And one thing that really has hit me and made me realize, Thomas App Catesby and Catesby App Roger are very frequently, even in history books, they are believed to be the same person. And they are two completely different people. And what I want to do for you today is give you a presentation about Catesby R. Jones and sort of tell you about who he is and what impact he was going to have on the events there March 8th and March 9th. And inevitably, when you start talking about the Civil War, one of the things that comes to the forefront is the naval side of the conflict is generally overlooked. In many instances, it's forgotten. We're fortunate here that March 8th and March 9th are days that have lived on in history. But there are other encounters which have been shortchanged, you might say. And whenever you ask simple questions, for example, who were the commanders, the Union Confederate commanders at Gettysburg, or at First Manassas, or at Appomattox Courthouse? Those are names that pretty easily roll off the tongue. But if you were asked the same question about who were the commanders at, or the Confederate Union commanders of the Merrimack and the Monitor, well, a lot of times those names escape our memory. And what I maintain is that the question is a little more difficult because people generally know less about the naval side of the Civil War. And in fact, this battle here, as important as it is, I maintain that this is probably the least known, most important battle of the Civil War. It has great implications. It ushers in a new technological era. After only 2 days of fighting, centuries of naval strategies and tactics are, for the most part, going to have to be discarded. The romantic age of sail is going to pass forever. And this will be the first time that you have two ironclad, steam-powered vessels encountering one another in combat. This battle is going to christen an era of iron and heavy guns. And for my particular subject, Catesby out Roger Jones. He was a man that many aboard the Merrimack considered too young. In fact, in 1862, he was only 41 years old. And it was shortly before midnight, on March 8th, after that first day of combat, that this 41-year-old Welsh Virginian, Catesby out Roger Jones, he sat at the desk in his cramped cabin there aboard the Merrimack, actually the CSS Virginia, and in most instances referred to, as Craig mentioned, because of the alliteration, generally referred to as the Merrimack. But what I have found is that Jones, in most instances, referred to it as the Merrimack. Most of the sailors who had served on that vessel referred to it as the Merrimack. But Jones, in any case, drafted a hasty account, albeit brief account, of the day's event that he sent to Captain French Forrest, the commander of the Confederate Constant Navy Yard here in Norfolk. First Lieutenant Jones, now serving as flag officer. He was going to serve in that position owing to Buchanan being wounded in the leg, but he nonchalantly claimed that his steam-powered ironclad warship had engaged the USS, well, there's Jones. Here we go with this technology problem. Had encountered first the USS Cumberland, and using the 15-foot iron prow, had rammed that vessel, ultimately tearing a gaping hole in her side. As the Merrimack pulled away, the iron prow broke, and the Cumberland would sink. Buchanan had then turned on the USS Congress and had fired on that vessel. And here we go. You can't really see the images because of the light, but trust me, there's an image here. But he had fired on the USS Congress and had literally riddled that vessel with holes. Later in the afternoon, the Merrimack had driven the steam frigate Minnesota and Roanoke into shoal waters, had exchanged fire with several small armed steamers, shore batteries, and Jones boasted in a very understated fashion that only shallow waters, impending nightfall, had prevented his deep draft Merrimack from destroying the rest of the Union flotilla. About 6:30 p.m., the Merrimack had fired her last gun, and about 90 minutes later, she had anchored beneath or under Confederate cannon at nearby Sewell's Point. During that period from about 8 to midnight, Jones had many duties to partake of. He had to make sure that the bodies of the 2 dead Confederate seamen were taken off. The 8 wounded, not including Buchanan, were taken to a nearby hospital. Prisoners were turned over to Confederate authorities. Jones then began talking with Confederate officers serving aboard the vessel. He tried to find out their perspective of the day's battle. He made a hasty inspection of the vessel. He didn't have time to examine the outside. Had he had realized that there were more than 98 dents in the iron casemate, and the smokestack had so many holes in it that a flock of crows could fly through it. Jones and others did not truly realize the destruction that had laid behind the Merrimack as she had anchored that evening. Most did not realize the true significance of what they had witnessed. And although Jones had unexpectedly gained command of this Confederate ironclad, he was not an unlikely candidate for the mission that he would undertake. In fact, Jones was born, Catesby out Roger Jones. We're going through a lot of Joneses here, so we'll try to keep them straight. Catesby out Roger Jones was born April 15, 1821 at Fairfield in Clark County, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley. He was the second son of Army Adjutant General Roger Jones and his wife Mary Ann Mason Page Jones. Mary Ann was the niece of Light Horse Harry Lee. She was the cousin of Robert Edward Lee. But the two had a very happy marriage. In fact, they produced 13 children. Catesby was the second oldest, the second son. And the family took extreme pride in its Welsh heritage. As an example, Catesby Ap Roger being given the designation Ap in his name. Ap is a Welsh prefix. It means son of. So Catesby, son of Roger Jones. That dignity, however, was much more deeply seated than the immediate naming of this child after his father. In fact, the young man's first name, Catesby, was the same as his paternal grandfather, Catesby Jones. And it was the same that he shared with his uncle, Thomas Ap Catesby. The name Roger could be traced back to Roger Jones, the progenitor of the family. The acting commander of the Merrimack came from a long, old established line of Virginia aristocrats. One time wealthy, one time influential. They had strong patriotic ties that would be passed along to their progeny. In fact, the original Roger Jones had come to the American colonies in the 1680s. He had served in both the English Army and the English Navy under King Charles II. Catesby's great-grandfather, Thomas Jones Jr., and his grandfather, Catesby Jones, had both served in the Revolution. His father had served as a professional army officer in the War of 1812. He had gained fame at Lundy's Lane, at Chippewa, at Fort Erie, and in fact, he had risen to the rank of brigadier general. He had served as adjutant general of the Army, longer than any other Army officer in American history. His uncle, Thomas Ap Catesby Jones, had joined the Navy in 1807. He had served on the Norfolk station before, in 1808, going to New Orleans. Spent from 1808 to 1815 there on the Gulf Coast. It was there in New Orleans that Thomas Ap Catesby would gain his opportunity for fame. In fact, in December of 1814, Thomas Ap Catesby, commanding 183 men and 5 small gunboats, confronted an overwhelming superior British force, and one by one his vessels succumbed to the enemy. But that sacrifice gained for Andrew Jackson much needed time to allow him to prepare the defenses of New Orleans for the British attack. And in fact, Andrew Jackson would never forget that Thomas Ap Catesby Jones had sacrificed his small flotilla for the greater good. Well, in June of 1836, Army Adjutant General Roger Jones and now Captain Thomas Ap Catesby Jones appealed to President Jackson for a midshipman commission in the U.S. Navy. 15-year-old Catesby Ap R. Jones was given a commission and immediately sent to New York City, where he would join the South Pacific Exploring Expedition. This expedition that ultimately went out under Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, but this time it was commanded by none other than his uncle, Thomas Ap Catesby. I guess this shows how those family ties can be very important to advance one's career. But in any case, the young Jones stayed there under the command of his uncle for a little more than a year. December of 1837, his uncle resigned because of health problems, because of political backstabbing, and with his resignation, most of the officers in his command, they resigned as well, including Catesby Ap Roger. Many of the men of that expedition resigned, and ultimately the command of that expedition devolved on Lieutenant Wilkes, a mere lieutenant. After his resignation, Catesby then moved to the Far East. He served in the Far East Squadron for about 3.5 years before returning to the United States in 1841. And it's here that he was going to start making a name for himself. He would secure an appointment in the Depot of Charts in Washington, D.C., which at that time was commanded by Matthew Fontaine Maury. And it's that position which gave him the opportunity to be introduced to naval science and to the brightest minds in the Navy Department, including Maury and including John M. Brooke. He stayed in that position for a short time before moving on to the hydrographical office, where he recorded magnetical and meteorological measurements, acquiring further scientific knowledge. What he had realized in a very short time in the Navy, about 5 years, is that the Navy provided few opportunities for advancement. I mean, in essence, there were 3 ranks in the Navy: lieutenant, master commandant, and then captain. Then captain. And because those positions were filled by rank and seniority, so an individual, whenever a position came open, it would go to the, say a captain position came open, it would go to the senior master commandant. So an individual could spend years in the Navy and still be a midshipman or even a lieutenant. So he saw his opportunities being very limited. So he tried to find other avenues to broaden his expertise. And he would find that through the scientific arm of the Navy. Jones would spend another cruise in the Far East trying to gain a ship's command. And by the time of the Mexican War, he would be recalled from the Far East and served in the Gulf Squadron. In fact, he would command a naval battery at the siege of Veracruz. And after that operation, he would then move to the coast of California, serving aboard the ship of the line Ohio, which, again, coincidentally, was commanded by his uncle. There on the coast of California, he didn't have much opportunity for fighting. In fact, he had a terrible time keeping the men aboard the vessels of the Pacific Squadron, because in 1849, there was a gold strike in California. The men were deserting in droves. And despite those hardships, he would make the most of his opportunity. In fact, in 1849, he would conduct the first thorough survey of San Francisco Bay, a survey that would be used by the Navy Department to determine where they wanted to place a naval post on the West Coast. And finally, in May 1849, he received his first promotion. It's been 13 years, and he was finally a lieutenant. It was a time of celebration, and the young Jones decided to take the grand tour of Europe, see all the capital, experience the good life. Well, that good life was problematic, because on December 4, 1851, while he was visiting Paris, he was caught in the middle of a street riot. What was happening is that President Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was in the process of converting himself to Emperor Napoleon III. And he had ordered his troops to fire indiscriminately into the crowds to suppress the rioters. Jones was caught in that street fire, and during the melee, he took 2 shots. One severed his left forefinger completely off. Another struck him in the thigh, the left thigh. In fact, he would spend months recuperating. That event left a very marked impression on this young man. In fact, witnessing that event made him realize how much despotic power a government can actually exercise when trying to suppress dissension, when trying to maintain power. That was something he would remember in the future. When he finally did return to duty, he took a position with young Lieutenant John Dahlgren. Dahlgren was in the process of developing a revolutionary type of weapon, which ultimately became known as the Dahlgren smoothbore gun. And during those experiments, Lieutenant Jones aided him greatly. In fact, in February 1856, when Dahlgren finally got the authorization to put his guns aboard a vessel, he chose the Merrimack. He installed those weapons on the USS Merrimack, and he requested that Lieutenant K.P.F. Roger Jones be his ordnance officer. In fact, for more than a year, Jones served as ordnance officer aboard the USS Merrimack. He became the most knowledgeable individual in the Navy, perhaps, according to some people, even more knowledgeable than Dahlgren himself about the operation of those smoothbore guns. In fact, he became so familiar with their operation as field pieces on wheeled carriages, as well as on the Merrimack, that he became, in many respects, the Navy's ordnance expert. From 1858 to 1861, Jones served in a number of positions, and wherever he was at, he was generally the ordnance officer. In fact, in 1858, when the Navy sent an expedition to Paraguay, which at that time was considered the largest naval expedition ever sent out, it was sent out to chastise the Paraguayans for firing on the USS Waterwitch in 1853. But Jones was called from abroad. He was serving on a foreign station. He was called back to the United States to serve as ordnance officer of this expedition. Here was someone who had made the most of his opportunity. By the spring of 1861, however, Jones was suffering the same problem that many other officers. Jones had been in the service for 25 years. Yet, he was still a lieutenant. He was well established in the naval service. He was highly esteemed by his peers, personally very popular with his men. But as Civil War loomed on the horizon, Jones had a hard question to ask himself. Would he remain loyal to the Union? And if so, he would be forced to draw his sword against his family and friends in Virginia. But then on the other hand, if he resigned that commission, he would have to take up arms against the flag under which he had served throughout his adult career. So for him, it was even more troublesome. In fact, his father and grandfather had been very patriotic. They'd served in the Army and Navy respectively. On the other hand, his grandfather and great-grandfather had served for their native Virginia, albeit in the Revolution. Jones, he'd been a loyal, patriotic officer, but there were some things that concerned him greatly. 25 years, and he was still a lieutenant. He abhorred the Navy's stagnant system of promotions. He saw that if he joined the Confederacy, there would be opportunity for advancement. But furthermore, Jones was a Virginian. He had strong ties to the state. He came from a landed family, a slaveholding family. And those were things that he could not forget. Furthermore, that event in December of 1851, when he had witnessed the French government suppressing dissension, that too made an impact. He saw that the government could have an effect on individuals. And for him, when Virginia chose to secede, he believed that that state had the right to break its bond. For him, Catesby Roger Jones ultimately believed that loyalty to his native Virginia was much more important than loyalty to the United States. On April 17, 1861, he resigned his commission in the United States Navy. 2 days later, he was appointed a captain in the Virginia Navy. Promotions come quickly. But of those 13 children, 6 sons, 3 would remain loyal to the Union, 3 would secede and join the Confederacy. In fact, his brother Walter Jones, a BMI graduate, a BMI graduate, served as a lieutenant in the Confederate Army. His brother Charles Lucian Jones, who was in the U.S. Navy, he served under Josiah Tatnall at Savannah, and then later served as the paymaster of the Tallahassee. His brother Thomas Skelton Jones, who had been, Thomas Skelton Jones became a captain in the Confederate Army and served with John Magruder in the Peninsula Campaign. Of his 3 brothers who remained loyal to the Union, only one would fight in the conflict. His brother, Dr. Eusebius Lee Jones, served as the commanding physician, a civilian physician at the hospital on Davis Island near New York City. His brother Winfield Scott Jones, who was the youngest, child number 13. He was very young when the war broke out. Furthermore, he was in California, so he chose to remain removed from the conflict. But his brother, Roger Jones, number 8 in the line, Roger Jones was a lieutenant at the beginning of the war. In fact, he was a lieutenant commanding a little arsenal in a place called Harper's Ferry. In fact, when Confederates advanced on that facility, it would be his responsibility to dispose of 20,000 stands of musket, which he promptly threw into the Potomac River. He dismantled the gun-making facilities and then fled just ahead of Confederates back to Washington, D.C. He would be praised for his service to the Union. In fact, he would ultimately obtain the rank of Brigadier General in the Army. And he, too, like his father, would become Adjutant General of the Army. So as you can see, Jones is torn. He has these family connections, and ultimately he chooses to go with the Confederacy for his own reasons. Less than 2 weeks after his resignation, Jones participated in an unauthorized attack on the Gosford Navy Yard in Norfolk. There, the Confederates captured 300,000 pounds of powder and shell, equipment that would be very instrumental for the Confederates in the First Battle of Manassas. On June 10, 1861, Confederate Secretary of the Navy Stephen Russell Mallory appointed him a lieutenant, back to lieutenant in the Confederate Navy. Appointed him to command the defenses, the naval defenses at Jamestown Island. And for 5 months, he would oversee construction there. He would construct batteries, build fortifications. On November 11, 1861, 7 months after he had resigned from the U.S. Navy, Mallory appointed Jones executive and ordnance officer of the CSS Virginia, then being outfitted as an ironclad warship in Norfolk. It seemed as if destiny had brought Jones back from where he had come. During the next few months, Jones would be responsible for mustering the crew, for hand-choosing or hand-picking the officers. He would be responsible for administering the ordnance. For him, it was a hard task because he knew that that vessel was not particularly seaworthy. He knew that that vessel, well, it would be limited in use. And during those months, he would work from sunup to sundown to try to prepare his vessel for its ultimate destiny. And as Professor Simons mentioned, that destiny came on March 8th, when the Merrimack crawled out of Norfolk, or out of Gosford Navy Yard, at a whopping 4.5 knots. 4 hours passed from the time that it cast off lines at Gosford to the time it reached Hampton Roads. It was a slow voyage. And as they moved into the Hampton Roads, through the spyglass, Federal fleet there at anchor, there were 1 hospital ship, 3 coal vessels, 5 tugboats, a side-wheel steamer, 12 gunboats, the screw frigates Roanoke, Minnesota, the store ship Brandywine, the sailing frigates Congress, Cumberland, St. Lawrence. 188 guns, more than 2,000 men. And here came this half-submerged crocodile. As Professor Simon mentioned, it was laundry day. And there, hanging from the riggings, white-washed uniforms hung from the starboard, blues dangled from the ports, lifeboats had been lowered. No one anticipated anything happening. There had been report after report of the impending arrival of the Merrimack. It should never come. There have been stories that the Merrimack was a complete failure. Yet, the Confederates continued to work on it. No one knew. No one expected. And that morning, when when the lines had been cast off, the men aboard that vessel believed that they were going on, quote, an ordinary trial trip. It was a shakedown cruise. Yet, when the Merrimack, bellowing dark smoke, steamed into the Hampton Roads, all of a sudden the smaller Union craft began scrambling towards shore like chickens on the approach of a hovering hawk. Signal flags were hoisted for the fleet. Dark black smoke began to bellow from the frigates Minnesota and Roanoke. Sails were unfurled from the sailing ships. And then all hell was going to break loose. Throughout the day, as the Merrimack attacked the Congress, the Cumberland, Jones ran throughout the gun deck, making sure that his men continued firing. In fact, it was not until Buchanan was shot that Jones would have the opportunity to meet his destiny. And what Professor Simons told you is that Buchanan was a flamboyant character. He was aggressive, energetic. And I have to beg to differ with Professor Simons. He mentioned that Jones was energetic. Jones wasn't necessarily energetic. He was very introspective, very quiet, unassuming, very, very committed to his profession. But he was not someone that he didn't have that charisma, that charm that Buchanan had. In fact, when Jones took command, he would continue fighting. In fact, according to Bob Miner, brave, cool, determined old Jones fought the action out in his quiet way, but giving them thunder all the time. According to Jones, they fought until it was so dark that we could not point the guns with accuracy. Well, about 6:30, the Merrimack fired its last shot on March 8th and then anchored beneath those Confederate cannon there at Sewell Point. And it was during the night that Jones wrote that important report. His vision of what had happened there on that first day of battle. But something else had happened as he was writing that report. The men were trying to bed down for a short night's sleep. And about 9 o'clock that evening, a strange-looking craft had arrived off the Minnesota. Lieutenant John Lorimer Worden, he and his crew aboard the USS Monitor had spent 48 hours trying to make it to the Chesapeake. And the voyage was perilous. In fact, stormy seas, stormy weather which had prevented the Merrimack from sailing until it finally did. But that same storm front had almost sunk the Monitor on its trip south. And after 48 hours, Worden finally gave his men a few hours rest. And shortly after midnight, as men were trying to bed down for the evening, there was tremendous explosion. The magazines of the Congress had finally detonated. And there in the brilliance of the burning Congress, you could see an unusual sight. A large cheese box, or as some called it, a tin can machine. What was that strange-looking craft? No one quite knew. On the morning of the night, the men believed that strange vessel was, some people claimed that it was a barge taking the boilers out of the Minnesota. Some claimed it was a water tank supplying the frigate. Others believed it was an immobile iron battery. No one expected that the Monitor was a warship. A warship that was coming out as David goes out to meet Goliath. But all Confederate doubt was removed when the Union ironclad's first shot struck the Merrimack. fact, at about 8:45 on the morning of March 9th, the Merrimack and the Monitor closed to within about 50 yards of one another, circling one another while trying to gain an advantageous position. The Merrimack's deep draft, poor steering, slow speed left her at a severe disadvantage. The Monitor, on the other hand, with a shallow draft, efficient engines, was able to steam circles around the Confederate warship. The ships moved as close as a few feet from one another, as far apart as about 100 yards, all the while maintaining a constant fire. The 11-inch solid shot from the Monitor's gun dented the rebel vessel's casemate side. On the other hand, the guns from the Merrimack, they hit the Monitor, but they did very little damage. For the men inside the Merrimack, it was a frightening experience. Can you imagine being cooped up in a tin can and have nothing but iron shells being thrown at it? And they combined with that terrible sound, crackling boiler fires produced intense heat, smoke from fire, from cannon, the loud, continual rhythmic beat of the Merrimack's engines, and yet Confederate guns were doing no damage. It was certainly not reminiscent of the day before. It was a frantic experience, and the men soon realized, the men aboard the Confederate vessels soon realized that their efforts had very little effect on their adversaries. Confederate morale began to wane as the exploding shells of the Merrimack simply burst into fragments against the Monitor's turret. Meanwhile, those in the Monitor, that ship had been untested as well. Many thought that they had signed aboard a compact, which they would simply go to the bottom of the Chesapeake. Their morale tremendously improved when they realized that the Confederate shells did not penetrate the iron hull, that they were safe inside, there was no water gushing inside the ship. After about 2 hours of almost continuous combat, disaster was going to strike. With all the circling and maneuvering, the pilots aboard the Confederate ship had become somewhat disoriented. And in their disorientation, the pilots had let the Confederate ship run aground. And with a 22-foot draft, mired in the deep mud of the Chesapeake bottom, she lay there helpless against the Monitor. This was Jones's opportunity to show his mettle. He quickly rushed down to the engine room, and he tried to impress upon the engineer the urgency of their situation. He told the engineer to burn anything that would increase the pressure for the steam engines. They were burning old rags, oiled cotton waistcloth. They were picking up the turpentine-coated splinters of the pine bastions. Anything that would increase the pressure. And as all these things were being thrown into the fire, it did increase the pressure. The engine turned the wheels, or turned the propeller feverishly. And yet, the Merrimack remained grounded. For the men, each minute seemed like an hour. And for 15 minutes, they were stuck. The whole time, Jones continued to try to impress upon the engineer that they must get out of this situation. Because 15 minutes, the Monitor simply fired its gun there at the Merrimack. Then, suddenly, the ironclad staggered backwards. It had finally pulled free. It moved into deep water. And from that, Jones was able to go to the gun deck. As he ran to the gun deck, ordering his men to continue fire, he noticed that Lieutenant John Eggleston, well, his men were just sitting down, resting, relaxing. And he confronted Eggleston and said, "Why do you not fire, sir?" Well, Eggleston responded that It would be a waste of precious ammunition, a waste of powder. Moreover, he claimed, quote, "I can do her just about as much damage by snapping my thumb at her every 2.5 minutes." Well, he could. And at that point, Jones, being an experienced ordnance officer, he came back to reality. He knew that the guns aboard the Merrimack could not penetrate the Monitor's hull. It was at that point he decided that he had to run her down. Well, with that decision, the commands, "Back the engines, now go ahead, now hard to starboard the helm, now hard to port," resounded throughout the Merrimack as Jones tried to position his ship for the ramming. Meanwhile, aboard the Monitor, you had Lieutenant Worden trying to prepare his vessel, trying to avoid a direct collision, continuing fire on the Confederate vessel. And fortunately for Worden, Jones's ship was far too large. It was far too unresponsive and far too slow to build up the speed necessary to inflict any serious damage on the Union ship. Also, shortly before the two vessels made contact, Worden turned the helm hard away from the Merrimack. And at that moment of terrible suspense, one sailor remarked, the Union warship suffered only a heavy jar, nearly throwing us from our feet. Well, the Merrimack's iron prow had been torn off the day before. Had Jones been able to inspect the outside of that vessel, he would have realized that it was gone. Nothing penetrated the half-inch iron hull of the Monitor. No water flooded into the Union vessel. It was about this time that Worden withdrew to shallow water to replenish the ammunition supply within his turrets. And to do so, the turret and the hull were separate pieces, but there were hatches in each, and the hatches had to be lined up so that the ammunition could be passed from the ship into the turret. And for about 15 minutes, Union forces handed shells up into the turret while the Monitor was out of range. It was at that point that many within the Merrimack thought the Monitor had fled, she'd run away. But once the supply of ammunition had been replenished, the Monitor came back to give battle. And at about 11:30, when the two ships were within 20 yards of one another, a blast from the Merrimack's pivot gun struck one of the side holes in the Monitor's pilot house. With that explosion, small fragments of metal, paint, gunpowder flashed into the pilot house. Coincidentally, Worden was preparing to look out that pilot house. He was hit directly in the face. He stumbled backward, powder and blood covering his face. He was holding his eyes, screaming, "I am blind!" His officers quickly ran to his aid. It was obvious that Worden would not be able to continue. In fact, he would be temporarily blinded from this little episode. And while his officers attended to his, the Union quartermaster aboard the Monitor, without orders, had turned the helm away from the Merrimack. And for 20 minutes, the Union ship moved away from the Merrimack. At that time, no one realized it. The battle between the two ironclads was over. As the two antagonists moved away from one another, men aboard both ships came to their respective decks for fresh air. For most involved, it had been a long, trying day that seemed to produce nothing. Minimal results. The ironclads had sparred for 4 hours and had done minimal damage to one another. The engagement did provide a tactical victory for Federal forces as the Monitor had fulfilled her primary objective. She had saved the frigate Minnesota. The battle allowed the Confederates to maintain strategic control over Hampton Roads the James River. In fact, Union forces could not move against Norfolk. General George McClellan's Peninsula Campaign of 1862 would have to be modified. And at that time, although many realized that neither side could claim victory, they did acknowledge that, some acknowledged, that history had been made. One Union soldier ashore remarked that the battle was one of the greatest naval engagements that has ever occurred since the beginning of the world. Well, it had changed the course of naval tactics and strategy. But the irony was that while these two ships on March 9th had this climactic engagement, they were both going to have somewhat ignoble fates. The Merrimack, well, she would be torched by Confederates on May 11, 1862, after the Union forces had finally captured Norfolk. In fact, Jones, as ordnance officer, would have the despicable duty of setting the match that destroyed his vessel. The Monitor, after her service here in the Chesapeake, she then proceeded south, where she sunk about 15 miles south off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. So those two vessels never did much after this particular engagement. But what interests me is that what happened to this Jones character? Jones had stepped into history. He had been the commander of the Confederate vessel on his most important day when he confronted the Monitor. He had made history. And for the rest of his life, that would be the defining moment. That would be the time that he wrote about again and again. And as he became older, he always remembered more detail. Perhaps a selective memory began to take over. He would embellish the story, and by the time, or by the point near his death, if you were to read his letters, you would think that, although he was somewhat humble, you would think that he had been the vessel's primary commander throughout the whole engagement, March 8th and March 9th. But after that episode, Jones would, as I said, ignite the powder that destroyed the Merrimack on May 11th. He would then command a naval battery against the Union fleet that was trying to advance towards Richmond. In fact, he fired on the Monitor again, yet from a land battery during that campaign. He then went on to command the ironclad Chattahoochee at Columbus, Georgia, the naval works at Charlotte, North Carolina. Finally, in 1863, he got that promotion he had so actively wanted. Promoted to commander. And with that promotion came a new duty, a new assignment. For him, he was transferred to the Confederate Naval Gun Foundry and Ordnance Works in Selma, Alabama. He would remain there to the end of the war. In fact, while at Selma, Jones was going to perform very important work for the Confederacy. In fact, it would be his guns, his ordnance that he produced there at Selma that would be used by Franklin Buchanan in his campaign against David Farragut in Mobile Bay. After the war, Jones did much better than most other Confederate officers. In fact, he had expertise. He was an ordnance officer. In fact, he would be hired by the government of Peru in 1866 as their ordnance specialist for the Peruvian army. He would even be offered command of a Peruvian naval squadron, but he refused in deference to native-born officers. After a brief stint in South America, where he made a lot of money, did quite well for himself, he returned to Selma, Alabama. He married, settled down, and began raising a family. He didn't have time to have 13 children. But in any case, despite this distinguished career as an ordnance specialist, both before and after the war, despite the engagement between the Monitor and Merrimack, for years after, he would view himself as only a player in this historic event. Yet, like so many others, he told and retold the story, adding details, publishing versions of his account. And it's ironic that after living through such a monumental event, Jones met such a casual demise. On June 21st, 1877, he was confronted by his neighbor, J.A. Harrell. Harrell pulled out a pistol and shot Jones in the chest. Why? Well, apparently the two men were in an argument because of their children. The children had gotten into a dispute, and Harrell was going to settle it once and for all by killing the father. And when I wrote this little book on Jones and the Merrimack, Battle of the Monitor, I'm always cautious when dealing with a biographical subject. And about 3 months after it came out, I got a call from a Dr. Martha Tyson, who was the granddaughter of Catesby out Roger Jones. She had read my book, and I was very curious to find out what the family had to say about how I presented their hero. Well, she was very pleased, except with one part of the book. Fortunately for me, it came on the last page of the text. I said here in this whole story, it was ironic, however, that after living through such a monumental battle, Jones should have been mortally wounded, not by Union forces, but in a domestic dispute with his friend and neighbor, J.A. Harrell. Well, Dr. Tyson informed me that J.A. Harrell was not a friend. But the story of Jones, Buchanan, Worth, the Monitor, the Merrimack, is part of a much larger drama of the Civil War. And while many of the soldiers and seamen of this event, conflict, have been overshadowed or forgotten, those 2 days in early March 1862 remain etched in time. If they didn't, we wouldn't be here today. The Monitor and Merrimack were revolutionary ships in a revolutionary battle, and those who fought in the engagement or witnessed it from shore soon realized that the world would never be the same again. Thank you.
Questions?
Well, that's good.
Actually, just to make a comment, it's interesting to me that I mentioned in my talk that the Superintendent's House in the Naval Academy is named for Franklin Buchanan. The drill field, where the midshipmen go out twice a week, unhappily, to march around back and forth and so forth, and maybe you've even seen on film some of the drilling of the brigade, is called Warden Field. It's named for John Warden, who commanded the Merrimack. There is nothing at the Naval Academy, alas, named for Jones. So you were talking about how he is often overlooked. I think that's
Very much so. And it really goes with the Jones family. His uncle, Thomas F. Catesby Jones, was one of the men who founded the Naval Academy. He was on the board of officers who created the Naval Academy. And apparently, while I think it's in Mahan Hall where they have the portraits of all the men who helped in the creation of the academy, it's somewhere I've seen, I can't remember where, but in any case, they don't have a portrait of Jones.
No.
So I'm working to rectify that.
Yeah, okay.
Comments? Questions? Okay, thanks very much. Oh, I'm sorry, got one hand.
What happened to Worden after that? He would be temporarily blinded for a while. He would then, when he dies in the 1870s, Craig, you probably answer this better than I can. He dies in the 1870s. This is really his defining moment as well. He eventually becomes an admiral, but he really contributes nothing else to the cause of the war.
The Virginia went out subsequently after this and tried to resume the fight.
Tried to, yes,
Go to the Monitor.
go to Monitor back in the battle.
And nothing happened.
No.
Why was that?
What purpose was it?
Well, I mean, obviously, I gather what happened was the Merrimack went back to the dry dock, got fixed up, went back out to fight, the Monitor never got repaired.
Well, the Merrimack did have some slight alterations, repairs. But on the other hand, the monitor had performed its primary duty. It had maintained protection for the federal fleet there. And now that the Merrimack had been persuaded to retreat or to move away, why should she sacrifice or jeopardize herself again?
She basically stayed under the fort's gun.
Basically stayed on the fort's gun as well as the rest of the federal fleet.
Was the Merrimack capable of going after a fort?
No, I would say no. Because the guns in the fort, I think, were of sufficient caliber that they could have done much more damage. Because what was happening in the battle, and at the time no one really was aware of this, the iron casemate on the side was cracking. The oak behind was splintering. And that's why Jones believed that they had to pull out of that butthole. Because if they didn't, enough shots and the iron casemate would crack and fall off. Because as Professor Simon mentioned, it was being held on by bolts. And if you crack it in enough places, it'll just disintegrate, crumble.
That's a sneaky, tricky question I was asking Craig. I thought he could solve it. The Navy Board restricted those Daltons on the monitor to a 15-pound charge. And as you mentioned, they were cracking the plating and they were cracking the backing. And those Daltons were normally about a 30-pound charge.
Well, one of the problems
The sneaky question, how much difference would that have made in the velocity?
I would say some.
Same answer I gave.
These people that had it right on the tip of his tongue.
Well, one of the problems you have is that by increasing the charge in the gun, sometimes you're taking the chance of the weapon exploding.
That's why I didn't do it.
Yeah. And had he been, I mean, he was an ordnance officer. If he had thought it was feasible, I'm sure he would have
No,
done
I was talking about mine. Federal vote was restricted to 15 by the Navy Board in Washington. And they were doing considerable damage. But I was just curious how much difference. I was at 30 pounds would have knocked it all to pieces after I did.
Well, Ed, you might be able to answer this. See, in my understanding, there was still a tremendous amount of skepticism about the performance.
The Navy Board is following up the worries about the peacemaker blowing up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They're scared to death when they damn near killed the president. Killed a lot of other people. They're very skeptical of everything else from the peacemaker.
if one of those Daltons blew up, the whole party was over. So,
And if you had one of those dogs blow up in the turret, then you effectively,
sunk the boat.
well, even if you didn't sink the boat, no longer was it capable of fighting.
the party was over.
Yeah.
I think later in the war, that we all can later monitors mounted one 15-inch and one 11-inch gun. And in the fight in Atlanta, both weapons penetrated that armor, which is similar to that. But they were using the larger battle charge that they could cover.
There weren't 11 inches. Remember,